Good day, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Boss Economics World, where we dissect global and local economic issues that others try to sugarcoat. But you know how we do it here. We know the real crisis isn't just the numbers on the papers, it's in the decisions, or shall we say, blunders made by governments and central banks. When politicians fail, who pays the price? We do, the regular consumers, the savers, the small investors, the people struggling to get by. And today, we're focusing on Europe's economic drama, where both the European Central Bank, ECB, and the EU's largest economies, France and Germany, are facing a perfect storm of political chaos, fiscal dysfunction, and economic slowdown. Let's get down to business. As if dealing with multi-decade high inflation wasn't enough, European politicians are collapsing like dominoes in a region that's supposed to be Europe's economic engine. Now it's not just external shocks, a war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, Trumpian trade wars, that are rattling Europe's prospects. Their problems hit closer to home, in the halls of governments in Paris and Berlin. And let me tell you, this isn't just a bad look for Europe. It's a full-blown crisis for the world economy if this drags on. Buckle up, it's going to be a rocky ride. Let's dive into the political mess first. France's President Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz both stepped into leadership shoes with ambitious plans. But, folks, reality hit them hard, and will hit ordinary Europeans even harder. France's budget negotiation failures and Germany's unraveling coalitions are now sending shivers down Europe's already fragile economy. In Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz's three-way coalition government has already given up the ghost. Coalition disagreements have left Germany with no real direction on its economic policies. You can't steer a sinking ship without a rudder. Meanwhile, in France, no sooner had Michel Barnier, Macron's premier, proposed cuts to the deficit than his government hit a deadlock. Macron is scrambling to bring in a new prime minister and somehow pass a fresh budget through a parliament that's already rejected it. Remember Macron's repeated promises of fresh reforms and fiscal discipline? Well, they're falling apart. And let's not sugarcoat it, this is bad news for France's economy, which needs serious repairs after years of underperformance. Now here comes the ECB, led by Christine Lagarde, stuck in the middle. Their usual problems of managing inflation have been hijacked by this political powder keg. The question now keeping Lagarde up at night, and hey, it should keep you up too, is, how does the ECB even gauge inflation risks and economic growth projections when so much is uncertain politically? Should they raise interest rates to cool inflation, or should they cut rates to spur a slowing economy? It's like asking a juggler to ride a unicycle on a tightrope while spinning plates. Spoiler alert, something's bound to fall. Fabio Balboni at HSBC summed it up perfectly when he said political and policy uncertainty is pulling the ECB in opposite directions. On one hand, they're still facing sky-high inflation, which needs cooling down to protect the consumer's purchasing power before it erodes any further. For that, they'd want some fiscal tightening, finally getting those national budgets in line. They had hoped France would lead the way with sound fiscal management next year, but now that has dissolved with Barnier's arm wrestling over the €60 billion cut. On the other side, Lagarde and her peers need to boost growth to prevent a recession. Manufacturing has stagnated, consumers are hitting the brakes on spending, and businesses aren't investing. France, Germany, and by extension all of Europe, are teetering on a fine line between stagnation and contraction. Geez, what a situation. So, the ECB is forced to lower interest rates further. Last October, after the economy showed alarming signs of slowdown, Lagarde fast-tracked a quarter-point rate cut, the fourth in the last few months. Expect another rate cut this Thursday. It should, in theory, make borrowing cheaper, spur investments, and fuel consumption, but it also risks long-term inflationary pressures. But wait, this isn't all good news. Rising political risks stunt economic correction. Financial markets are already reacting, French bond yields shot through the roof, signaling how jittery investors are about France's fiscal health. But here's the kicker, the ECB has a special weapon called the Transmission Protection Instrument, TPI, to rein in swirling borrowing costs in individual countries. But guess what? Bundesbank President Joachim Nagel had to bluntly remind everyone that they don't use it for political problems. That's right. If your government messes up, the ECB won't save you. And for once, they're actually smart about that. This tool isn't meant to babysit dysfunctional governments, it's to manage genuine market instability. But when entire political regimes collapse before your eyes, don't expect a central bank to be your knight in shining armor. They may tweak a few things here and there, but markets need confidence. Without functioning governments in the eurozone's two heavyweight economies, how is anyone supposed to believe Europe's growth forecasts? Now, you might be thinking, sure, Europe is a mess right now, but how does that affect me if I'm not invested heavily in Europe or even live in Europe? Oh, trust me, it does. Europe is one of the world's largest trading blocs, and instability there has ripple effects globally. Imagine a scenario where Germany, a major export powerhouse, slows down further, and its imports dry up. Factories stop ordering overseas components, manufacturers hit the brakes, and demand for raw materials and energy nosedives. This means fewer orders from countries like China or the US. Those pipelines are deeply interconnected. And Europe faces even bigger threats if confidence collapses completely. What happens if investors start pulling their money out of vulnerable European economies and rushing into the US dollar or Swiss francs? The euro plunges further, and suddenly emerging markets with euro-denominated debts become the next dominoes to fall. Let's not even get started about what happens if people begin losing faith in EU authority as the political turbulence turns into a full-blown crisis. EU bonds could take a hit, which would impact institutional investors worldwide, from pension funds to sovereign wealth investors. And if you think about how Donald Trump, yes, he's back in the headlines, could potentially reignite trade tensions with Europe, especially around tariffs, we're looking at a multi-pronged breakdown in the global order. So here's the scenario: political dysfunctionality within core European states, compounded by ECB's incapacity to respond swiftly to external threats, Ukraine war, Middle East conflicts, US trade tensions, will throw several wrenches into global economic stability. Chaos abroad is never contained. So, what needs to happen? Well, the plain truth is that Europe needs to get its act together, fast. Without a stable government in France or Germany, it's impossible to make credible long-term economic policies. The worst part is the lack of predictable leadership in both nations, which prevents the ECB from having any meaningful partnership with them on fiscal policies or reforms. Macron needs a new government in place that can push forward audacious fiscal reforms and growth-friendly policies. Germany, on the other hand, will need a successful resolution in its new elections come February, but the path leading up to coalitions won't be pretty. Friedrich Merz, who could emerge victorious in the polls, isn't exactly promising when it comes to timely compromise, so don't hold your breath just yet. And this protracted political uncertainty across the eurozone's powerhouse economies will keep both growth and investments stuck in limbo. While economists like ING's Charlotte de Montpellier point out that without reforms, the kind Mario Draghi himself called crucial, Europe's long-run malaise will only deepen. And that's a future none of us want to see. It's a daunting situation, but let's be realistic: the ECB will likely be forced to cut rates even faster than previously expected if this political paralysis leads to a sharp drop in confidence. With households tightening their belts and business investments stalled, the ECB may face scenarios reminiscent of past crises: interest rates at zero, or worse, dipping back into negative territory, and no clear-cut path out. Folks, Europe's political and economic chemistry right now is looking dangerously explosive. Decades of fiscal indiscipline, fractured leadership grids, unpredictable trade policies, and external conflicts, all this puts Europe at a critical moment. The Eurozone's biggest economies have governments that can't pass budgets and central bankers who can't control inflation and growth at the same time. Do I need to spell it out for you? We're standing at the crossroads of potentially the biggest European economic crisis since the Eurozone debt debacles of the early 2010s. If this follows through, expect more unemployment, an even weaker euro, cold credit markets, and panic selling in European assets. Everyone should watch this space closely because the next months could define whether Europe inches into recovery, or sinks into an abyss that could drag others down with them. And surely, whatever happens in the heart of the Eurozone won't stay in the Eurozone.